At first glance, it looked like a funeral, rows of wooden caskets each draped in the national flag of Burkina Faso. A choir of silence broken only by the sound of a president's boots on concrete and his head bowed in grief, not as a politician, but as a soldier. But this wasn't just a moment of mourning, it was the beginning of something far greater. 50 of Burkina Faso's finest soldiers had been ambushed and killed in a mysterious military strike near the country's eastern corridor. No warning, no mercy, just silence and blood. Within days, something shifted across the nation. What began as shock quickly transformed into purpose. President Ibrahim Traoré, once seen as a young and bold voice for Africa's future, made a declaration that changed everything. This will not be answered with speeches. It will be answered with action. And he meant every word. Behind closed doors, new weapons are being built by Burkinabé hands. Russian special forces have landed. The streets are humming with volunteer enlistments. Local farmers are training with rifles. Musicians are turning grief into war songs. Children are planting freedom trees. From mosques to churches, people are praying for one thing: sovereignty. This is no longer a revolution of words. This is a war for dignity. And here's the question: has Africa finally reached the moment where it refuses to kneel even if it means standing alone? If you've ever wondered what it takes for a nation to rise from ashes and claim its place on the global stage, this story will show you. And by the end, you may find yourself asking, what would we do if it were us? Please like, share, and subscribe if you believe that sovereignty is not a gift, but a right that must be defended. It began just before dawn. A military base tucked along Burkina Faso's eastern corridor, usually quiet and secured, was jolted awake by a barrage of explosions. Witnesses said the sky lit up before the sun had a chance to rise. The attack was brutal, sudden, synchronized, and devastating. Within minutes, over 50 Burkinabé soldiers lay dead. Communications had been jammed, surveillance drones were disabled, backup forces were blocked. The base was overwhelmed before anyone knew what was happening. It was, by all definitions, a surgical strike, but who was behind it? That question haunted the nation, and not without context. Just days earlier, President Ibrahim Traoré had received a formal invitation from the United States. Washington wanted to honor him with a prestigious Leadership Achievement Award in recognition of his development work in Burkina Faso. Cameras were ready, red carpets planned. But Traoré did something few expected. He refused. Flatly, publicly, unequivocally. He didn't even board the plane, nor did he send a representative. "We are not for sale," he later told local media. "Our dignity is not negotiable." Shortly after, representatives from a large U.S.-backed organization also flew into Ouagadougou, hoping to meet the president privately. They never made it past the front gates of the presidential palace, and then the soldiers died. The timing was too precise, too political, too bitter to ignore. Though no foreign power has been officially blamed, whispers quickly turned to accusations. Across the capital, ordinary citizens, journalists, and regional analysts began to ask the same question: was this a punishment? Posters of the 50 fallen men were printed and plastered across walls in every province. The flags were lowered, schools suspended classes, government offices stood still in mourning. But beneath the sorrow, something deeper was stirring, not fear, but defiance. President Traoré, a former captain himself, attended the mass funeral in full military uniform. He didn't speak from a podium. He stood among the mothers, the widows, and the soldiers. He wept openly. He knelt at each coffin, and then he left quietly, not to grieve, but to prepare. That same week, a team of engineers and young graduates were quietly escorted into a previously abandoned facility just outside the capital. Once a simple repair depot, it was now being transformed into something else entirely: a domestic weapons plant. Secretive, fortified, and completely Burkinabé controlled. Inside, teams began constructing long-range, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. Not imported, not donated. Built from scratch using blueprints drawn up by local minds and supported by allied partners. This wasn't charity, it was capacity. It was ownership. At the same time, intelligence briefings showed another development. A Russian military aircraft landed discreetly at an airfield in the north. Within hours, special forces units began setting up camp, not to take over, but to train side by side with Burkinabé forces. These weren't mercenaries. They weren't foreign boots dictating policy. These were instructors combat-tested, equipped, and ready to help a sovereign nation stand on its own terms. Traore never asked for NATO's approval. He never issued a press release begging for help. He made one phone call, and it wasn't to Washington. Within 48 hours of the funeral, Burkina Faso had initiated one of the fastest military mobilizations in West African history. New enlistments surged. Military academies opened new classrooms. Volunteer centers sprang up in towns and villages. The message was clear: never again will we be unprepared. This wasn't just an administrative decision, it was a national awakening. Even before military analysts could weigh in, local radio stations were broadcasting community updates on enlistment drives. Women's groups were organizing food supplies for soldiers. Elders were donating land for training camps. Teachers rewrote morning pledges at schools to include the names of the fallen. It was no longer about 50 men. It was about an entire nation, about an entire generation saying enough. And this was just the beginning. In a dusty compound near the outskirts of Ouagadougou, something unprecedented was taking shape. Behind guarded walls, beneath the hum of generators and the clang of metal, Burkina Faso was building its own missiles. Not imported, not gifted, built. From scratch. Young engineers, many still in their 20s, worked side by side with former military officers and university instructors. Their mission was simple: create a defense system that would ensure the nation would never be caught off guard again. They called it Operation Kulpilgo, named after a word in Moore meaning the shield of the people. But it was more than a military operation. It was a philosophy, a total transformation of how the nation saw itself. No longer just a state, now a citadel. Traore knew that retaliation didn't have to mean reckless strikes or symbolic shows of force. It meant building something that would last longer than any missile discipline, self-reliance, and unity. So while drones were being assembled in secret, a much louder movement was growing above ground. Across the country, enlistment centers overflowed with young men and women. Many had never held a rifle, some didn't even know how to read. But they came with conviction in their hearts and fire in their eyes. Communities rallied around them. Local chiefs donated land for training. Farmers brought grain. Artisans volunteered to build barracks and latrines. Elders shared knowledge of the terrain. And most powerfully, women led the chants. In the town of Kaya, a group of mothers who had lost sons in the attack organized what they called the March of the Matriarchs. Dressed in black and red, they walked barefoot through the city, chanting old warrior songs and raising wooden staffs as symbols of memory and resolve. Their message was not vengeance. It was readiness. "We do not hate," one of them said, "but we will not be helpless, and neither would their children." In primary schools, teachers began holding daily sovereignty circles where students learned the names of the fallen, the history of Burkina Faso's struggle, and the meaning of national defense. In many classrooms, children planted saplings in the yard, each one named after a soldier. The arts responded just as powerfully. Street murals now bore the faces of the 50 fallen soldiers, not as victims, but as guardians. Local musicians turned funeral prayers into marching hymns. In marketplaces, radios played songs with lyrics like, "We bury the dead with our tears, but we rise with our hands." Traore didn't issue orders from a marble balcony. He walked among the people, visiting training camps, inspecting drone prototypes, and meeting with village elders. His speeches weren't written by publicists. They were responses to the people's own words. And then came the most decisive move yet. Traore announced that $300 million previously earmarked for international development grants and foreign partnerships would be redirected into domestic military innovation. No more dependency. No more waiting for outside approval. Burkina Faso would fund its own security, develop its own doctrine, and protect its own people with its own hands. Critics abroad called it reckless. Traore called it necessary. Alongside this, he ordered the establishment of 13 national preparedness centers, one in each region. But these were not traditional military barracks. These were people's academies, training centers for civilians. There, young volunteers didn't just learn how to shoot. They studied African history, revolutionary theory, ethics, and the responsibilities of self-defense. Each participant received a single message inscribed above every entrance: sovereignty begins in the mind. But it didn't stop there. Traore also introduced a new national curriculum for secondary schools that included courses on national resilience, foreign interference, and local governance. In universities, new departments on cyber defense and strategic communications were created, often taught by Russian and Malian instructors brought in under new defense cooperation agreements. Burkina Faso was not just preparing for war, it was preparing for permanence, and it was no longer alone. Russian military instructors became regular fixtures at joint training drills, not commanding, but collaborating. They helped rewrite outdated manuals, adapted strategies for drone warfare, and introduced tactics for countering psychological operations. Their goal wasn't to dominate, it was to transfer knowledge. According to military insiders, 5 Burkinabé drone squadrons were under development, with some already conducting live surveillance over high-risk zones. These weren't symbolic units. They were real operational and locally commanded. By this point, even the most skeptical international observers had to admit Burkina Faso was not bluffing. The question wasn't whether the retaliation was coming. It was already here in the minds, hands, and hearts of the people. And as one elderly villager told a journalist while handing his walking stick to a local guard, "If they try again, we won't be afraid. We'll be ready." What happens when a nation refuses to be broken? In Burkina Faso, the death of 50 soldiers didn't fracture society. It forged it. Something rare and difficult to define began to stir, not just in the capital, but in the hills, the markets, the mosques, the shrines, and the fields. A new kind of citizenship was being born. At first it was small gestures. A farmer offered his harvest to the local training center. A retired teacher volunteered to give literacy lessons to new recruits. A Christian pastor and a Muslim imam joined hands and led a prayer for national unity in the central square, but soon these gestures became waves. In the city of Bobo Dioulasso, a group of high school students began a program called Guardians of the Red Line. They met every evening after class to study military strategy, African liberation history, and first aid. Their goal wasn't to become soldiers. Their goal was to become conscious citizens, ready to defend their country not only with weapons, but with wisdom. In Ouahigouya, a women's collective started manufacturing uniforms and first aid kits using recycled fabrics. One of the organizers, a mother of 3, said, "This is our way of holding the line. Not all of us carry rifles, but all of us carry responsibility." What emerged was more than defense. It was ownership. Government officials noticed. For the first time in decades, local mayors were holding open assemblies to listen to their communities. Military officers were sent to villages, not only to train, but to learn to hear from elders about regional threats and terrain knowledge. New legislation was drafted to formalize the role of civilian auxiliaries in national defense, not as militias, but as recognized extensions of the republic. And perhaps most critically, the education system was rewritten. President Traore authorized the creation of a national civic intelligence curriculum to be taught in every secondary school. It included subjects like foreign interference, historical resistance movements, media literacy, and local governance. The goal wasn't to indoctrinate, it was to vaccinate the youth against manipulation. This wasn't the kind of patriotism taught through flags and anthems. It was the kind that teaches a child how to recognize when their sovereignty is being stolen. The spiritual dimension of the crisis also deepened. On the first Sunday after the funeral, churches across the country held synchronized masses for the fallen. On Friday, mosques did the same. On Saturday, traditional priests burned sacred incense and invoked the names of ancestors in public ceremonies. The country, divided for decades by religion and political class, was now praying together in unity, not uniformity. The national television station broadcast a rare interfaith program called One People, One Soil, where imams, priests, animists, and atheists sat side by side, not debating theology but discussing how to protect the spirit of the nation. The message from every corner was the same: we were not born to be ruled by outsiders. And that message began to shift political tides as well. Traore's approval ratings, once uncertain among intellectual elites, began to skyrocket. Not because of charisma or promises, but because of action. Because he didn't hide behind statements. He delivered facts, factories, training camps, legal reforms, drone squadrons, and above all, transparency. Even critics in the media began to shift tone. One opposition journalist wrote, "You can disagree with the man, but you cannot deny the movement." International NGOs, once seen as saviors, now faced hard questions from local communities. Why did you go silent after the attack? Villagers asked. Why do you call for peace only when we defend ourselves? It was not rage. It was revelation. The African Union, under mounting pressure from citizens across the continent, was forced to acknowledge the situation, albeit too late and too soft for many Burkinabé to accept. The people had already moved on. They were no longer waiting for permission to act sovereign. Perhaps the most symbolic moment came weeks after the attack, when a group of orphans, all children of the fallen soldiers, visited the presidential palace. President Traore didn't give them medals or money. He gave them a promise. Your fathers gave their lives. We will build a country where you never have to. And then he knelt not in weakness, but in vow. In that moment, Burkina Faso ceased to be just a country reacting to tragedy. It became a country rebuilding itself through it. Not from top-down policies, but from a bottom-up conviction that never again will sovereignty be a theory, it will be a lived, practiced, and protected reality. It was not a protest. It was not a speech. It was the beginning of a new national contract written not in ink, but in blood breath and unwavering belief. In Washington, the silence didn't last long. Think tanks across the capital scrambled to release emergency briefings on the situation in the Sahel. News anchors who once praised Traoré's leadership as youthful and refreshing began using a new set of words: radical, anti-Western, dangerous. The narrative had changed almost overnight. Diplomatic channels lit up behind the scenes. Several ambassadors from NATO countries quietly requested meetings with Traoré. They came not with accusations, but with offers, intelligence sharing, financial incentives, technical cooperation, all carefully worded, all conditional. The message was implicit: we can help if you come back into the fold. But Traoré didn't flinch. His answer, reported by insiders, was as short as it was final: Burkina Faso is not for sale. That refusal didn't just rattle foreign embassies, it embarrassed them. Because for decades, the playbook had worked carrots and sticks diplomacy wrapped in dollars. But not this time. Meanwhile, Western media intensified their scrutiny. French outlets ran exposés on Traoré's background, questioned his legitimacy, his youth, even his mental health. Editorials asked if Burkina Faso was sliding into authoritarianism, ignoring the voices of millions of Africans calling it sovereignty. Russia, by contrast, didn't hold back. Kremlin spokespersons openly praised Traoré's courage, calling him a symbol of modern African defiance. Russian state media showcased Burkina Faso's drone program training drills and national mobilization as a model for post-colonial resilience. China, more cautious, expressed concern about the destabilization of West Africa, but quietly opened back-channel discussions with Ouagadougou, reportedly to explore future trade and infrastructure deals outside the Western sphere of influence. And the African Union, its silence became deafening. Weeks passed before any official AU statement appeared, and when it did, it was vague, generic, and politically neutral. For many Burkinabé, this wasn't diplomacy, it was betrayal. Hashtags began to trend across West African platforms: Africa for Traoré, not another puppet, from Mali to Niger to Ghana. Young Africans voiced their frustration not just with Europe or the US, but with their own institutions. It was no longer about colonialism, it was about complicity. As embassies in Ouagadougou increased their security and some foreign staff began quietly returning home, one thing became clear to the world's most powerful nations. This wasn't just a rebellion, this was a reordering, and they weren't in control of it. This story didn't begin with politics. It began with silence. The silence of a military base just before dawn. The silence of a nation bowing its head before 50 fallen soldiers. And then the silence broke. What followed wasn't a speech or a press release. It was something far more profound, a people long dismissed as poor, weak, and dependent choosing to stand. Not with anger alone, but with structure, courage, memory, and clarity. In the heart of West Africa, a doctrine is being written not by generals in foreign war rooms, but by teachers, farmers, mothers, and artists. By children planting trees for the dead. By engineers building missiles with bare hands. By elders handing over land to train a new generation. And at the center of it all, one man stands: Ibrahim Traoré, not above the people, but among them. Whether the world accepts it or not, a new message is echoing across the continent: we will not be threatened. We will not be bought. We will never be unprepared again. But let us not be naive. The price of sovereignty is high, and the forces that oppose true independence, economic, military, informational, are vast and well-funded. They have ruled for centuries, not because they are wise, but because they are afraid of a world they cannot control. And now that fear is growing. Because Burkina Faso, a nation they once ignored, is setting an example that others may soon follow. So we ask you, our viewers, is this the beginning of a new African century, or the beginning of a new global struggle over who controls it? Can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré to lead this path, or should a new generation carry it forward? And most importantly, what would you do if it were your soil, your sons, your sovereignty on the line? If you're watching from the United States, know this. This is not a foreign crisis. This is a mirror. It asks us, what does freedom mean if we deny it to others? Please subscribe if you believe that dignity must never be negotiated. Share this story if you believe that what's happening in Burkina Faso deserves the world's attention. And comment below, because your voice matters more now than ever. The next chapter is being written now. Let's not miss it.